The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I am your host, Len B.A. Good to have you with us. With me this evening is Christina Baal-Owens. Christina Baal-Owens is Executive Director of PublicWise, a voting rights organization that works to secure a government that reflects the will and protects the rights of the people. She brings nearly 2 decades of experience in electoral and legislative campaigns, advocacy, government, and nonprofit management. A social worker by trade who started her career in the labor and immigrants' rights movements, she views social change work through the lens of the direct impact and accessibility of enacted policies on communities. Christina first developed a passion for making voting accessible to marginalized communities as Director of Civic Engagement at the New York Immigration Coalition, where she ran one of the largest voter registration programs for newly naturalized immigrants in the country and led a statewide immigrant voter table. Following her time at NYIC, Christina served in the political departments of 2 major labor unions, RWDSU, where she was Deputy Political Director, and 32BJ SEIU, where she was a State Legislative Coordinator. Directly prior to joining PublicWise, she was the Assistant Comptroller for Community Affairs at the New York State Comptroller's Office. Christina also brings a wealth of experience running campaigns and IEs at the city, state, and federal levels. Notably, she was the New York State Organizing Director for Hillary for America in 2016, where she ran a program that generated voter contacts in all 50 states. Christina Baal-Owens, welcome to Talk of the Bay.
Thanks, Len, for having me.
And am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Yes, you are. Actually, that's gold star to you because it's not very common.
Okay, well, I have a last name that nobody can pronounce, so I always I feel bad if I don't check ahead, and I didn't, but we're lucky. So thank you, and thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and you're on the East Coast, so you're even working late to be here, so I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, so happy to be here. Thanks.
So right now, the Supreme Court is deciding whether former President Donald Trump is immune from prosecution for his efforts to stay in power by overturning Joe Biden's election victory. And they're also deciding whether prosecutors properly charged hundreds of January 6 defendants using a law that makes it a crime to obstruct or impede an official proceeding. How will the outcome of these cases impact the upcoming election?
So I think there's a lot of ways that this case can affect the election. The one that we're really focused on at PublicWise is how it's going to affect how voters can trust the system. And so back in 2021, and actually half of these focus groups happened before the January 6th insurrection and half happened after, we talked to eligible voters in battleground states who chose not to vote. And in 2020, as you probably remember, there was a resurgence of things like vote by mail, early voting. There's a lot of different ways that people could participate in elections, but there were still people, even in battleground states, who chose not to. And so when we did these focus groups, one of the common themes across states was the lack of accountability. And so what people would say to us is, my vote won't count, or, people will do things to tamper with my vote and nothing ever happens to them. They don't go to jail, nothing happens. And then after January 6th, we heard things. People are saying, look, we'll see what even happens to these folks, whether or not they even get in trouble. And this case is going to really answer those questions that we were hearing back in 2021. Are these people going to get in trouble? Is a president above the law? Where at PublicWise, we feel very strongly that no one is above the law. We believe that, anyone who is working to silence the voices of voters, especially those who are using violence to do so, needs to be held accountable. And what happens in this case is going to send a clear message to voters across the country of who is held accountable and how. And you may remember even, in 2016, there was a single mother who in Texas who voted by provisional ballot thinking she was eligible to vote and she wasn't. And she was sentenced to 5 years in prison. So if she can be sentenced, of course, she was a Black single mother. If she can be sentenced to 5 years for mistakenly voting, what does that mean for how the law is going to apply to these hundreds of protesters and to a former president of the United States?
Yeah, and you mentioned the word trust when there's clearly what I will call a bias in the treatment of, say, someone who votes by mistake, not even knowing that they're not supposed to be doing what they're doing, versus somebody who tries to, completely upend an actual election result. There's a question of proportion there. And trust is a big issue in the United States these days. It seems that a lot of government institutions and politicians in particular have very low, people just don't trust them. And, we see that, all the way from the federal government all the way down to some local governments. Just because use that word, it just struck a chord for me. In your work, in the work of PublicWise, trying to help people make use of their constitutional right to representation, how much of an issue is trust in bringing people in to registering, to actually participating in elections, and how big an issue does it play in voter turnout?
It plays a major issue, and we're in an election cycle now where we have a repeat matchup at the top of the ticket. We have a lot of examples of laws that are suppressing votes. We have a lot of examples of ballots that are being thrown out. And the reason that trust plays such an important role is it's a huge motivator of whether or not someone is going to take time off of work to go vote, whether someone is going to stand in a long line. If they don't trust that their vote is going to be counted, and then if they don't trust that an elected official is going to be accountable to them or represent what they want, or if they're not going to uphold their campaign promises, there's very little motivation to go out and vote. And we know that participation, especially by the groups that are the most disenchanted right now by elections, is what is really important for long-term change and for progressive policies. Yeah,
and we have so many forces at work right now trying to, you could say, reverse what gains have been made in the last 50 to 75 years. As far as the Supreme Court goes, one of the other cases they'll be deciding shortly, I believe, is whether South Carolina's redrawn congressional map is an illegal racial gerrymander. And the justices are considering whether the maps violated the Constitution's bar on using race as an unjustified and predominant factor in drawing districts. And similar cases have been brought in Alabama and Louisiana. How important a role does gerrymandering play in making democracy work or not work? And what do you expect will be the outcome of these court cases?
So I can't speak to the specifics of these court cases, but what I can speak to is the history of gerrymandering, what it does to both, again, trust in the system, and what it does to dilute the voices of certain communities. So gerrymandering, if anyone has ever looked at, and I'm laughing a little bit right now because I was showing my sister, who lives 15 minutes away from me, a map of our congressional district because I wasn't sure if we were in the same one. And she's like, wow, I could never do your job. This makes no sense. Because you look at these maps and the way they're drawn, it is so clearly an intentional, it is an attempt to separate communities, or, it is created by folks in many states who are desperate to keep their jobs and are drawing these lines to keep their jobs. So gerrymandering is a tactic that has been used for over 200 years. It is something that people can use, for example, if there is a large community of Black voters in a county, you can draw a line right through the middle of that community so that their vote is diluted. Or you can pack them all into one district, which means that all the Black voters only really have a certain amount of choices. So there's just ways that state governments and state legislatures are drawing these lines to benefit themselves, to keep certain parties in power. And, once you look at the maps, you can see that that's very true. So these cases are really, they're going to say a lot for the future of the work of redistricting. It's a process that happens every 10 years, but the work that is done to lead up to how these lines are drawn is happening constantly within those 10 years between when redistricting happens. And what I think is, again, I can't speak to the real specifics of these cases, but what I think is really concerning is that these maps in South Carolina, the same court has already said that they were unconstitutional. But here we are again, and they're ruling on the same maps. And it's a very confusing process, even for someone like me, who this is my entire job, to be working on voting rights. So as an average voter, again, these are the kind of things that erode trust and make someone just back away and say, listen, politics are not for me. I'm not going to participate in the system that I really can't understand.
Yeah, I saw an excellent documentary entitled Slaying the Dragon, which was about campaigns in a couple different states. And unfortunately, I can't remember exactly which states they were, but a couple campaigns in a couple different states to have nonpartisan redistricting instead of partisan gerrymandering. And one of the things that struck me is that the data has gotten so refined now, and they're able to use computers to do all this stuff, that they showed one district line that literally, as it went down a block, it sliced up in order to pick up two houses. Like the district boundary went along the property line to capture those two houses into the district and go back onto the street. And when they can do that level of detail in order to select where the politicians get to select their voters, it's pretty stunning. California and a handful of other states now have nonpartisan redistricting. Is there progress on trying to deal with gerrymandering in any other states in the recent past?
Yeah, and you brought up a really good point. The states that have independent redistricting commissions are where we're seeing real progress. I will say a great source of information on this is Eric Holder, since the former AG, has started an organization that is dedicated completely to redistricting. He's one of the national experts on this and someone that we partner with at PublicWise on this issue. He has some really great information on this. But, the states that we look at, Michigan, there was a ballot initiative in 2018 that supported transferring the power to draw the state's congressional and legislative districts from the state legislature to an independent redistricting commission. And, if you think about, in a common sense, not even sort of this like political nerd perspective, we should probably take that power away from the people that are trying to keep their jobs, right? Like we should have an independent redistricting commission so that there is some objectivity. So we're not looking at lines that take the two houses that I really want in my district, right? Or someone really wants in their district. Arizona is another state that has an independent redistricting commission where we've seen a lot of progress. And one of the issues, though, that we're looking at as we see which of the states have these independent redistricting commissions is there's no federal standard and there's no federal floor right now of how this can look. So it really looks different state to state. You mentioned, California has one rule, New York has another, Maryland, where I am, has another. So at PublicWise, one of the things that we've really been doing for the last several years is advocating for the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Act at the federal level, so that there is some sort of federal standard and federal floor of how lines are drawn and just in general voting rights.
Yeah, great. And I'm really impressed, in looking at your website at PublicWise to see all the different research and resources that you provide to make other people who are also active on the issue of voting rights, have tools at hand that they can use that really inform this process. If listeners, if you're just joining us here at K-Squid for Talk of the Bay, my guest is Christina Baal-Owens. She is the Executive Director of PublicWise, a national voting rights organization. Christina, one of the things that PublicWise has done is in 2022, you issued an insurrection index, which listed politicians and candidates who participated in or endorsed the violent attempted obstruction of the election certification on January 6th, 2021. And you've recently released a new report called the Election Threat Index. Can you describe for us what went into those reports and what they tell us?
Yeah, so these are interactive tools that we created that, again, we wanted to make public and easily accessible by average voters, by press, by campaigns, by anyone who wanted to use this information. And so the Insurrection Index, which we started in 2022, looked at people who were involved in the January 6th insurrection. And our definition of involvement was either attended at, spoke at the rally, organized for, funded, or otherwise spread misinformation that led to the January 6th insurrection. And we wanted to look at those folks that were running for office across the country. So we tracked races that ranged from federal, House races, Senate races, on down to school board. And in the midterm elections, we saw that 222 people who were insurrectionists won their races and are sitting in office. So
Wow.
we had set, part of this is setting a metric that we could apply to all folks, looking at what their involvement was before we can deem them an insurrectionist. We used resources like Ballotpedia, the Voting Rights Lab. We had partnered with them to look at legislation in different states. And, we used that information as well as, FEC and looking at who was running where to create that tool. It is something that we keep up to date now because we're really aware that January 6th was one day in a very organized movement. And part of that movement was getting insurrectionists who uphold these, white supremacist values into office. So that is something people could take a look at still at insurrectionindex.org. And then the part 2 of that was the Election Threat Index. So we're looking at offices that are state level on down, meaning more local, for people who are known election deniers. And again, we had a metric of what that meant, and who have jurisdiction over election administration. So far publicly, we've released Arizona and Pennsylvania. Of the 8 states we're looking at, Pennsylvania has the largest number of election deniers in office. Arizona has a shocking stat as well that 53.3% of Arizonans are represented by an election denier in the state legislature.
Wow.
So that was a tool that we were using because, again, we're looking at how this movement is really looking at getting into offices that are very low on the radar. I know we had to do an incredible amount of research to even see in these states who is responsible for election administration. Because as I said, it's different, not only state by state, but county to county. So we wanted people to know who is responsible for their elections in their county, which of those folks are electable, who are appointed, how they got into office, and then any actions they have taken to either deny election results, to not certify, to call for audits where there was no evidence of fraud. So meaning using taxpayer dollars to, to complete what, Katie Hobbs in Arizona called it a fraudit for that reason. The incredible amount of taxpayer dollars that went to looking for nothing when there was no evidence. But we wanted this to be accessible to folks because, again, this is really, election law is incredibly confusing because of how different it is county to county. So this is part of what we are doing to shed some light on this process and to make the process more transparent.
Yeah, and it is pretty oblique. It's hard to get a handle on what's going on when it really varies so much, as you said, even not just state to state, but county to county. And there were a number of states that have introduced laws, and many of them passed in the last few years that place additional restrictions on voting. Could you talk about some of those laws and what their effect is?
Yeah, so, I will say also on their face, some of these laws look really innocuous, but then when you look at their effects on certain communities, often communities of color, then you can see, what the intention is behind these. So in Arizona, recently, Native groups sued the Secretary of State's office over laws that dictated what could be used as proof of address and even the formats that addresses could be submitted in. And so it seems like, of course, you need proof of your address and just write your address down. But in a lot of Native communities, which in Arizona can make up entire congressional districts or large swaths of congressional districts, the addresses are not written into traditional, street number, street name format, right? Either, I was at a panel in Arizona recently where people saying like, my address has been 20 yards past the yellow house, or, where it has been something of that nature, which can't be written or is not accepted on a voter registration form. And also their proof of address will also contain that. So they are unable to register to vote by nature of what their address is. Often people will have a P.O. box, and that P.O. box address is not accepted. So a lot of the folks in Arizona that are representing Native voters are working to ensure that their communities can register to vote, and that these laws that, again, on their face are completely innocuous but have real discriminatory impact can be changed. In Pennsylvania, we see a lot of laws that just make voting confusing. In 2020, there was, the naked ballot issue where mail-in ballots, this seems it's funny to even talk about these things. Your mail-in ballot had to be returned in 2 envelopes, an envelope inside an envelope. If you were missing an envelope, your ballot got tossed out. That is simple as that, right? Wow. So it's a very human error that someone can make. And again, I believe that voting is often made purposely complicated to suppress votes. So in Pennsylvania right now, our partners at Democracy Docket, as well as the NAACP, are challenging a state law that says that in those ballots with 2 envelopes, if I were to submit my mail-in ballot within the proper time, the postmark says I did it, but I wrote the date incorrectly or forgot to write the date on the second envelope, my ballot could be tossed out. So there are people challenging that type of law as well, because again, it's not common sense. You can see the postmark, right? I returned my ballot on time. So again,
the ballot's in the envelope arrives at its destination. Like that just seems so counterintuitive.
And an entity that is not me stamped it saying I mailed it on time, but there was a human error and now my vote's not being counted. So that is something that some of our partners are fighting it back against. And, one of the laws that I have been most floored by, and I was in Alabama, I was in Selma when Senator Alphonso Butler did a field hearing on this. Alabama has a law that has recently passed that is, of course, being challenged that says that would criminalize the act of helping someone learn how to vote absentee to up to 20 years in prison. So an example of that could be my elderly neighbor needs help filling out her ballot. Her eyes aren't great, or, she needs help picking it up. She doesn't drive. I could be criminalized in that act of me picking up her ballot for her and helping her fill it out. They claim it is against ballot harvesting, but really, elderly voters without access to vehicles, disabled voters are all suffering because this is a very nonpartisan act of civic engagement and civic duties, helping each other vote, educating people on how to vote, and is being criminalized up to 20 years. That is a meaningful and lengthy jail sentence. And so these are the kind of laws that we're seeing across the country for people who are simply trying to cast a ballot for who represents them.
Yeah, and I remember here, I don't know the status of this law, but I know there was a law at least under consideration in Georgia that would have made it illegal to provide water or snacks to people waiting in line. Like, unless you've written, a campaign statement on the bottle or something, like, why is that a bad thing?
Well, and it's really funny because. Not funny. It felt very purposeful. In 2020, there was some amazing organizing. One of the organizations that we funded, I can think of, called Joy to the Polls, that was, acknowledging that some people are waiting in line for hours at a time and trying to make those hours, more one, that someone could actually stay, giving them water, standing in the heat, bringing food. They had literal dance parties and flash mobs and, trying to encourage people to stay in line. And it was really successful. And I can't help but think that that kind of organizing was really scaring people who are in support of suppressing votes. And so they passed laws. I mean, that was so specific that, I think they saw how effective some of this community organizing was.
Yeah. And that's something that, almost anyone can do. Get a few friends together and go, help people out who are waiting in line to vote. Tremendous. And you're working so much on, well, number one, helping the general public be informed about what's going on with voting rights, but also helping people navigate the process, advocating on, for or against appropriate policies to make voting easier or harder, as the case may be, and helping, including you've done a lot in your past of helping people just register, get into the system so they can participate. We have a situation in the U.S. where you could say it's a very imperfect democracy. I mean, we have the right to vote for our representatives, but of course, in the Senate, it's not a population-based distribution of senators. It's 2 per state, regardless of whether you got 800,000 citizens in the state or 38 million. And, similarly, the president is elected by the Electoral College, which skews the vote slightly again because it's based on the number of senators and congresspeople from each state, which has kind of made the vote irrelevant in a lot of states in this, as far as the presidential election is concerned, because your state's going to go one way or the other. It's kind of like, well, okay, why bother? So we have this issue of people who just don't vote. And in our last election here in California, the one that just happened in March, we had a turnout of about 40% statewide. And that's 40% of registered voters, and we don't even have everybody eligible registering. So clearly there's an issue of people either feeling like participating in the process takes too much time and energy, or they're completely just alienated by it. They don't feel like it's meaningful in any way, or they don't have the basis for making a choice. Where do you think things might move in the coming years that might change that in some way and maybe get us to a position where we might be able to, say, enhance the democracy as well as protect what we have?
So for us at PublicWise, our theory of change and what we believe in doing is really empowering the folks that are trusted messengers in these communities. So it's not me going around or our staff going around to our states of Arizona and Pennsylvania and North Carolina and Georgia. There is a lot of really great organizing that has been happening for years or decades in some cases, where people have built good relationships with folks, and they are able to educate and message the importance of voting in a way that is not shame-based, that acknowledges, and I'm very passionate about, actually, you have to acknowledge the fact that voting is difficult, that it is easy to feel hopeless, that it is easy to feel like nothing changes. From starting from that point to really showing people how small acts like voting or small acts like getting involved in your community really can create positive change. And, it's interesting, as you were just talking about living in states that you feel like your vote doesn't matter. I am from New York. New York, obviously, in the Electoral College is not a target state. But the House, the path to a Democratic House somehow now runs through New York. And it's because within your district, you're not just voting for the president, you're voting down ballot for, House is even a federal, it's a bigger race, right? So those races can be determined. I worked on a state assembly race in New York that the difference was 16 votes. So those down ballot races that arguably have more of an impact on your life, that decide, which of the schools and hospitals in your community get funded, which roads get built, what your kids are learning in school, what your access to healthcare looks like. Those are races that are decided often by very small margins. And starting there and educating voters on that with people they trust and with people that understand their perspectives and what they face is something that we found to be really effective in encouraging more people to participate.
That's a really important strategy, and I want to come back to that. But we're going to take a really short break right now, and we'll be back with more with Christina Baal-Owens right after this. Don't touch that dial. And if you're just tuning in to Talk of the Bay here at the K-Squid, my guest is Christina Baal-Owens. She is the Executive Director of PublicWise, a voting rights organization that works to secure a government that reflects the will and protects the rights of the people. Christina, we were talking just before the break about how when you try to work on issues in specific places and specific states, you work with local organizations. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you coordinate with them to protect voting rights and democracy, and maybe you might have a couple examples. Oh, and my apologies. I did not turn your sound on. There you go.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Am I on now?
Yes, you're very on.
Great.
Definitely.
So I think my background here as a former executive director of a service organization really helps this perspective because, we work with groups that I can use Arizona as a good example. Some of the groups have been organizing since SB 1070, so the Show Me Your Papers law in Arizona, where as young people or younger people, they came into this movement fighting for immigrant rights, right? So it was really focused on that. And then they saw how voting was a huge part of any issue where they were trying to create change, where they wanted to be sitting on the other side of the table of someone that they elected who either believes in things similarly to them, and I should say and feels accountable to them because they know that they are someone that can move votes in their favor or not. So we work on what we call a funds plus model. In addition to financial support, we work really closely with these partners to set them up with other resources that may be helpful to them. So I like to call us the consulting firm of the movement. Things like fundraising support or legal compliance, which is, quite honestly, super boring, but really important to be able to run your programs and ensure that you are being compliant with the very complicated election laws that are in your area. Or if you need support, getting access to press, or with, we even had examples in 2020 when people were really moving from door knocking to text banking because of COVID. And, we were able to loan out our chief information officer who happened to run the text banks in New York on the Hillary for America campaign. She was able to go in with these community groups and even just help them figure out how many phones do you need? How do you train volunteers? What is the software you need to do this? So we really tried to work holistically with these groups so that they can have the research and the resources that they need to be really strategic and impactful.
That's great. Yeah. So there's, as you mentioned, giving people the necessary legal help, the logistical assistance in getting through the system. And obviously, the funding makes a huge difference for these community-based organizations. So that's a wonderful way to really be sort of like the pollinator of the efforts to secure voting rights all over the country. So mainstream media, it tends to focus a lot on elections and politics like a horse race. They spend a lot of time on who's ahead and not very much time on the actual issues. And we're often confronted with polls, and polls claim to give us some kind of a prediction of election outcome or of positions on issues if they're polls of voters. But we've seen that sometimes polls can be very wrong. Is there a way to tell if a poll is more or less meaningful or reliable?
So I have to say, thank you for asking this, because as an alumni of the presidential in 2016, I feel particularly hurt by polling and inaccurate polling, and just feel like as a community that cares about democracy and elections, we really need to learn more about what polling actually means and what it doesn't. So the first thing that's really important to learn about polling, and I will say we have an incredible research team. I know you spoke to Dr. Jessica Kaufeld a year or two ago. We have an incredible research team of sociologists who are PhDs that have taught me a lot about how research is conducted and what it can really do and not do. So polls are a snapshot of today. So if we were to field a poll today, we would know who people are planning to vote for today. It is incredibly hard to predict people's future behaviors. So you can ask questions like, who do you plan to vote for in November? And people will answer honestly, but there's no way to predict, the October surprise, or to predict what other issues will come into, the media or into the race, what else will be affecting people's behaviors. So polls are really helpful, especially as someone who does a lot of field work or has my backgrounds in fields in campaigns. Polls are really helpful to look at who you need to talk to, what are issues people care about, what is motivating to someone today, what would motivate them to either vote for your candidate or now in the advocacy side to vote at all. They are not crystal balls. They cannot tell us what's going to happen in November. They can tell us the work that we should be planning between now and November. One of the things also that's important is looking at who was surveyed. So how many people were surveyed or polled, the makeup of that, how they recruited. So, if you're recruiting in Democratic clubs, obviously that's a very biased sample. Also weighting in samples. So if you're trying to look at a national survey, you want your sample, no matter what the size is, to look like the country, right? So it should have the right number of men and women. It should have, diversity in age that reflects what the categories are, or the demographics of the country. It should have racial demographics that look similar. So not just randomly choosing a large group of people, but making sure that group is weighted to look like the population you're actually trying to learn about. And then also, we want to look at, how the questions are asked. There are often some leading questions. There was a really good example with Ketanji Brown Jackson, where one of the questions, I can't remember, it was a major news network. They asked, do you think that President Biden should recruit a Black candidate, or should he keep his campaign promise? Let me go back. It was, should he recruit Black candidates because of his campaign promise, or should he look for the most qualified candidate generally? So, anyone's going to say, right? Like, you can't ask those kind of leading questions. The questions have to be asked in a way, and our researchers actually, they will spend an hour on, how two questions are asked to make sure it's not leading in any way, to make sure it's not giving any bias from our part. So all of those things together will put together a poll that you can trust and look at for what is happening now. And, we have, because polling is something we do, it is one of the best tools we have. It also should be used in the context of other data points. We have on our website a couple of pieces on, how to read a poll, the problems of polling, things I just explained, and also talking about what to keep in mind when you're reading election polls. And we did that also because we know that a lot of the organizers at our organizations don't have research background, but want to be strategic and use research well. So we tried to make it something that is easily digestible and that people can use when they are looking at the polls and consuming the polls and then trying to apply them to their program.
That's a great tool. And what was is there a title to look for regarding polls?
So one of them is Research 101, How to Read a Poll, which we did in January of 2024. Research Polling Simplified, What to Keep in Mind when Reading Election Polls. We did that right around the midterms in November 22, and the problem of polling, which was also in November 2022.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've noticed myself, we get surveys. I think all of us get them from time to time, at least where I am, I seem to get them very often. And oftentimes there are, questions are posed as black and white that are not black and white. Are you for this or against it? Well, wait a minute.
Right.
I'm making trade-offs here. Like, well, it depends. What about this other thing? Or just, as you say, leading questions that don't really allow you to establish a context for an answer. Like, you might be in favor or against something happening in your own city, but you might have extremely opposite reasons for being in favor or against it to your neighbor. And if you don't have some way to establish what the fundamental value is that goes into the answer, it's kind of, well, it can be very misleading. 60% of people are in favor of, and well, what do you mean? And what was the question that they answered? So I appreciate that you've made those resources available. I think it really helps us get tuned in. So, in general, you're so much working at the detailed level of really specific issues in specific places, trying to help people get registered, access the polls, vote, get the information they need in order to make an educated decision on their voting and so forth. But there's kind of a larger picture for me that I'm very aware of in the United States, which is, how do we get to a place where we have a much more substantive and resilient democratic process. And I wondered if there are, if from PublicWise's point of view or your personal point of view, if you see kind of a pathway of what you would like to see happen, say in the next decade, that will really help us have a much stronger democracy.
Well, the first thing that comes to mind when you say that is I would love to see access to voting and the idea of people's voting actually counting be depoliticized. So it should not be about what party you're in if you believe in voting, right? It's become something that has become, in the work that we do at PublicWise, we always look at, we are a nonpartisan organization that believes in voting, but it has become really associated with one party. It has become, oh, you're a Democratic operative because you believe in voting. No, I believe in democracy. And I don't understand how having people be able to access their ballots, to have their votes counted, to have common sense laws that allow people to understand who they're voting for, where to vote, and to believe that their vote will be counted. I don't understand how that's partisan. And I'd love to see the rhetoric move away from that. And, obviously I'm not naive enough to not know why it is, but I would like to see us, move away from that framing of it. Because I will say, even progressive pro-voting advocates are doing that to ourselves. So that is one way I think that matters. One thing that I think will bring us closer to a really well-functioning democracy. Another thing is, and it's in our mission statement, is having a representative government. It is API Heritage Month, and I am of Filipino descent, and I, growing up, never saw anyone like me in government, and I still, we just, I'm not there anymore, but I guess I'm forever a New Yorker. New York just elected their first Filipino American to their state legislature, in a state where the Filipino population is quite large. And, having people run from affected communities and be elected and having access to resources that will allow them to be viable candidates and to have professionalized campaign staff is really important. And I think when we have a government that looks like the people they're representing and understands, the problems that the people they represent face and the struggles that they face, and like you said, the nuances of issues, like how those things affect individuals and communities, I think we'll be in a much better position than we are now, and a lot of people don't see themselves in government and don't hear their interests being represented in any sort of political debate.
Yeah, and having an opportunity for people to be elected who really do represent what I'm gonna call, the people of the neighborhood, of the community. I'm old enough now, I was born in the 50s, to have witnessed for years having the sense that all politicians were basically white men, and many times with law degrees or business degrees or something. Mm-hmm. And to see that beginning to diversify, I personally find very gratifying. But it does seem like there was a sort of an entrenched system that tend to screen out people who didn't fit a particular profile as far as getting into elected office. And part of that has to do, obviously, with the money it takes to get elected. And I wondered if, I don't know if PublicWise is working at all on campaign finance, and I know it's a very tangled up issue right now because of Supreme Court decision that said money is speech. But how big a role do you think money plays in skewing the political outcomes?
It plays an outsized role that is really unfortunate. I'm seeing it from the perspective of someone who used to run campaigns and now is, in a position where I'm helping to either fundraise for candidates or, direct resources. I mean, we look at like the Warnock race, and, it's the most expensive Senate race in the history of our country. And the numbers that we're getting are really only from the campaign apparatus. They're not looking at the community organizations who ran independent expenditures. And, we're getting into the number that's at the top of mind right now is 55 million. We can fact check that. But
wow.
Having that on one Senate seat, I mean, this is also what scares people away from running for office, right? And it's, as you said, that it's funny because I remember in fifth grade creating a board game about how you become a politician, and the first thing you had to do was go to law school. And that was the idea, was that, there was only people of a certain caliber that could pay for a certain type of education that could be in office. And while that has changed, we're right now at PublicWise talking to candidates around the country, and the amount that they need to raise for these local races is prohibitive. And instead of a candidate going out into communities and talking to the people they're going to represent and building those relationships and finding out the issues, they're doing call time to funders who they may or may not end up representing, could be in or out of district, to raise funds to, buy TV time and, do all the things that happen in campaigns. But I think, the amount of money that it takes to run for office, for sure scares people away, and for sure, keeps people who are from affected communities that don't necessarily have those relationships where they can call around to their friends and family and raise $1 million. That is something that I think we need to really look at as to why it's so expensive to run for office. And then I will also say that, as an organization that works in multiple states, the campaign finance laws are different in every state. So how we can even support candidates in every state, we have to pay a legal team to be able to put that together for us. So there are just so many hidden costs that, again, make it that someone who is not surrounded by wealth or has access to wealth would just feel like, forget it, I can't do this, right? And I think we really need to look at one of the long-term changes I'd love to see is how can we make it more accessible to actually run for office.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's until the Citizens United case is somehow legislated to irrelevance, it makes it very complex. We had a local initiative campaign. California and most of its cities have initiatives, citizens initiatives. But we had a local initiative campaign here that was outspent 4-1. And, it's very difficult when you've got that much money going into all the mailers and the radio ads and whatever, to, even kind of, even affect the awareness of the average voter, because there's just such a flood of information in opposition, and oftentimes misinformation in opposition. And we've seen it both at the local level and the statewide level here. So I want to give you first an opportunity to talk a little bit more about anything else that you're working on that you'd like our listeners to know about, and then especially how they can possibly benefit from the resources that PublicWise makes available, and also how they can support your efforts.
Yeah, so we just rolled out our endorsements of pro-democracy candidates in several states, including Arizona, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. A lot of these folks are running against known election deniers. We will be launching work in those areas that will be working with some of the community groups to educate and make sure that we are combating misinformation, and then also supporting the candidates. So people can go to our website at publicwise.org and take a look at those endorsements, learn more about those candidates, learn more about these very local races that are very important to your day-to-day life. And we're also launching the remainder of our 8 states. So we have 6 more states in the Election Threat Index that we plan to be releasing by mid-June. So people can take a look at who in their local government is a known election denier, and what those folks affect in their ability to cast a vote in their state. So that can be found also on our website or at electionthreatindex.org. And then we have some research that I'm really excited about that is coming out on single issue voters. So voters who are choosing who they are voting for only on a core issue that is really important to them. So that could be the war in Gaza, that could be access to abortion, that could be immigration, and looking at who those voters are, where they live, and is there messaging that could help keep those voters in the electorate. And we should be releasing that work in the next few weeks.
Yeah, that sounds really valuable. And I know people who have gone to other states even, and done door-to-door canvassing on behalf of various campaigns. If someone wants to participate in helping secure voting rights, help people get to the polls, or whatever they can do to support a good turnout and an equal representation for all people, are there particular things that you would advise them to do?
Yeah, so we have an incredible group of partners that we work with in our key states, which are Arizona, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, who are working in communities that could all use your support. You can go to our website under our partnerships tab and take a look. And something I will say, even though I was just talking about money in politics, is these programs are incredibly resource intensive to run, especially if you are working with communities that are either bilingual and translation is involved, who are transient, so they're renters, they're in communities where, they are not homeowners, so lower income or transient voters. It takes more money to talk to those voters and to do that kind of outreach. And arguably, those are the voters that are really going to create long-term change. So I would really encourage people to go on our website, take a look where you live, or close to where you live. Take a look at some of these groups that we really trust, that we have vetted, that we believe in their work, and they're either our volunteer or donor opportunities for them. We have it at PublicWise. We don't say the most important election of your lifetime, because I think that's said every election. But I will say, as someone who's been doing this, I need to update my bio. I was younger then, for over 2 decades. This is, I think, the toughest election cycle I've seen because of disenchantment, because of funder disenchantment, because we're facing, it's a repeat face-off. There's just a lot of the state of the world. There's a lot of things that are making it harder to bring people and keep people in the electorate. So all of these groups need your support. And also you can give to PublicWise, and we re-grant, and we can move resources really quickly to these groups that are doing the frontline and incredibly important work.
Wonderful. Well, Christina Baal-Owens, it's been a real pleasure to have you on the program. Really appreciate your time. Thank you for being here. And I look forward to seeing the work that comes out of PublicWise over the coming year.
Thank you so much for having me.